Hello, this is Ben Television News Roundup, a compilation of major stories in the week ending. I'm Tunde Alabi. Thank you for being part of the program today. The British Prime Minister Theresa May has insisted that the UK is leaving the EU, but it aims to agree an arrangement that will ensure that the UK has independent free trade policy with the EU, maintains no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. However, the Labour Party has criticized the government's infighting over agreement on ideal customs relationship with the European Union.
Does the Prime Minister agree with her Foreign Secretary that the plan for a customs partnership set out in her Lancaster House speech is in fact crazy?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, we are leaving the European Union, we are leaving the customs union, but of course, for our future trade arrangements, a trade relationship with the European Union, we will need to agree customs arrangements, which will ensure that we leave the customs union, that we can have an independent free trade policy, that we can maintain no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and that we have as frictionless trade with the European Union as possible. And I'll tell the right honourable gentleman what's crazy. What's crazy is a leader of the opposition who for years opposed TTIP and now has a policy that would mean Labour signing up to TTIP with no say in it whatsoever.
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, could the Prime Minister explain why she and her cabinet wasted weeks working up proposals that the EU said was unworkable, the Foreign Secretary described as crazy, and does she agree with her Business Secretary, who apparently backs the crazy customs partnership proposal, but made it clear he doesn't back a technological alternative when he told the BBC that jobs would be at risk if we don't sort out a comprehensive customs deal?
What the Business Secretary said on Sunday was that it was absolutely right that we should be leaving the customs union. And if the right honourable gentleman wants to talk about jobs, I'm happy to talk about jobs. Half a million jobs lost under the last Labour government, record employment rate under this Conservative government.
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, the government says it has two options. The Foreign Secretary says one is crazy. Sir Ivan Rogers, our former EU ambassador, said that the technological alternative is a fantasy island unicorn model. They have two options, neither of which are workable. The case for a new customs union with the European Union is clear: to support jobs and living standards. Why is the Prime Minister ignoring all the major business organisations, all the major trade unions in backing a customs union? Isn't it time she stood up to those described last night by the father of the House as these wild right-wing people?
Prime Minister!
We are leaving the customs union. What we are doing is ensuring that we deliver customs arrangements that leave the customs union, that ensure no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, as frictionless trade with the EU as possible, and an independent trade policy. But what would Labour give us? They want to go into a customs union with the European Union, with no say over trade policy, with Brussels negotiating trade deals in their interest, not our own. The Labour manifesto said they wanted to strike trade deals. Now they've gone back on that policy. Typical Labour, letting Britain down once again.
Jeremy Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, she presides over a divided cabinet. She's had 23 months. She has had 23 months in order to negotiate an agreement and hasn't made any progress on it. The CBI says a comprehensive customs union after transition is a practical, real-world answer. The TUC, on behalf of 6 million workers in this country, put it simply, ruling out a customs union risks jobs.
Right.
The government continues to reject a new customs union, but at the weekend the Business Secretary made clear that neither of their options would be ready to be implemented by December 2020. So can the Prime Minister tell us what is her preferred option and on what date it will be ready to be implemented?
Minister.
Well, the right honourable gentleman talks about the length of time in the negotiations. Of course, it wasn't until March and the agreement to move on to the next stage of negotiations that it was possible to have discussions with the European Commission on the customs arrangements. There are two options. There are two options that were in my Mansion House speech. Questions have been raised about both of those options, and further work continues. But I just say, if I may say this to the right honourable gentleman, he has spent an entire career opposing a customs union. Now, when the British people want to come out, he wants to stay in. I know he's leader of the opposition, but that's going a bit far.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, due to divisions within the government, these negotiations are in a shambles. And this House is being denied the opportunity to debate crucial legislation affecting the future of our economy and communities all over Britain.
That's right.
So can the Prime Minister now tell the House when we will debate the trade bill and when we will debate the customs bill? She's had 23 months in order to get ready for it.
Minister.
The right honourable gentleman talks about the state of the negotiations. The right honourable gentleman talked about the state of the negotiations. Before December, he was saying that the negotiations weren't going to get anywhere. What did we get? A joint report agreed by the European Council. He said before March we wouldn't get what we wanted in the negotiations. What did we get? An implementation and an agreement with the European Union Council. We're now in negotiation for the best deal for the UK when we leave the EU, and we will get the best deal for the UK when we leave the European Union.
Prime Minister.
3 months, we'd had a better answer than that from the Prime Minister. Mr. Deputy Speaker, how can they negotiate in the future interests of people's jobs and living standards when Cabinet members are more interested in putting their own futures first? Fundamentally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, how can this government negotiate a good deal for Britain to defend people's jobs and living standards when they're unable to reach an agreement within themselves?
Prime Minister.
I'll tell the right honourable gentleman what this government has been doing to defend jobs. A balanced approach to the economy opposed by the Labour Party. Changes in legislation to more workers' rights, often opposed by the Labour Party. We have been ensuring that we see the jobs being created in this country. Employment rate at its highest rate since records began. What we are seeing in relation to the unemployment rate is at its lowest rate for 40 years or more. This is a government that is putting jobs first at every stage of what we are doing. And last week, what we saw up and down this country, whether in Barnet or Dudley or Peterborough, was the British people voting to reject the Back to the Future economic policy of the Labour Party and the broken promises of Labour. They don't trust Labour and they don't trust their leader.
US President Donald Trump has announced the withdrawal of US from the Iran nuclear deal agreed with other world leaders in 2015. President Trump has repeatedly criticized the nuclear arrangement with Iran.
Blasting what he called its glaring flaws, Donald Trump announced the U.S. will leave the Iran nuclear agreement.
The Iran deal is defective at its core. If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Trump is immediately reimposing Iran sanctions, which had been lifted as part of the 2015 agreement.
Today's action sends a critical message. The United States no longer makes empty threats. When I make promises, I keep them.
In Iran, President Hassan Rouhani said he's open to staying in the deal, but warned Tehran could begin enriching uranium if the talks fail.
من به سازمان انرژی
I ordered the
اتمی
Iranian Atomic Energy Organization to be ready for action if needed, so that, if necessary, we can begin our industrial enrichment without any limitations.
America's closest allies had mounted a last-minute effort to convince Trump to stay in the deal. Britain's foreign secretary went so far as to appear on Trump's favorite cable news show, Fox and Friends.
But you've got to do that without just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, without scrapping the whole thing. Because if you do that, you have to answer the question, what next?
The Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2015 between Iran, the U.S., Britain, France, China, Russia, and Germany. Trump complained that the deal allowed Iran to resume some nuclear activities after 10 years. He didn't like that the accord didn't address Iran's support for militant groups, and he was upset it didn't restrict Iran's ballistic missile program.
We just can't let the political leadership of an important Middle Eastern country do what the Ayatollah is doing. It's wrong, it's immoral, it's not good for the Iranian people, it's not good for the world, and we've asked him to stop, and diplomacy hasn't worked, and you know, sometimes you just got to do what you got to do.
Without the U.S., it's unclear how long the deal will last. Some say not long.
This may not result in the collapse of the deal immediately. It probably won't. But eventually, it will lead to the collapse. Iran will eventually decide to withdraw.
And to some critics, that makes it more likely than ever that Iran eventually gets a nuclear weapon.
You know, when you sign an agreement and within 2 years you change governments, the next government reneges on the agreement, it's sure to make other countries that might enter into big agreements with you, particularly countries like the North Koreans that are most analogous to the Iranians of anybody else we're dealing with, think twice.
Trump said he is interested in negotiating a new deal with Iran. However, he said the same thing after pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord and the Trans-Pacific Partnership free trade deal. So far, there's been no apparent success at those renegotiations.
Meanwhile, European leaders have reiterated their support for the 2015 nuclear deal with Tehran. The decision to pledge further support for the deal came on the heel of U.S.'s decision to withdraw from the nuclear arrangement with Iran.
The 2015 nuclear agreement was hailed as a triumph of global diplomacy, an agreement to prevent nuclear proliferation forged over 7 years of tough negotiations. Europe reacted with dismay at the US withdrawal, saying it raises the risk of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East.
It is a key element of the global non-proliferation architecture.
Washington says sanctions will be reimposed on Iran in 3 to 6 months. The US ambassador in Berlin wrote on Twitter that German companies doing business in Iran should wind down operations immediately. European multinationals like aircraft maker Airbus have made big investments in Iran and could be hit by so-called secondary tariffs imposed by Washington.
Pour être clair, l'Union européenne est prête à contester auprès de l'Organisation mondiale du commerce toute mesure unilatérale qui attenterait aux intérêts d'entreprises européennes.
Iran's President Hassan Rouhani said Tehran would remain in the agreement, subject to negotiations with other signatories. The US withdrawal has empowered hardliners in Tehran, says analyst and former Iranian diplomat Mehrdad Konsari.
The supreme leader was resistant in terms of Iran wanting to open up further to the United States. But the point is that this is a battle that has been going on in Iran in the last 40 years, and the reformers, you might say, having attained JCPOA, were on the winning side, and they would have made further progress with time if this had not happened.
US President Donald Trump argued the deal placed very weak limits on the regime's nuclear activity. and failed to address what he called Iran's malign activities in the region. But his call for a new deal with the Iranian government is alienating political opponents, says Konsari.
When he says in clear terms that he is willing to listen to Iranian leaders, come up with new suggestions, or to come up and make a new deal with him, that he is ready, willing, and able to act, that means he is not intending on changing the status quo in Iran, which is what people who want regime change were hoping for.
But Iran's regional adversaries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Israel, welcomed the US withdrawal.
Rather than blocking Iran's path to a bomb, the deal actually paves Iran's path to an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs.
Iranian officials are to meet Monday with the foreign ministers of France, Germany and Britain to discuss the future of the nuclear deal.
Still on the U.S., the U.S. President Donald Trump says the U.S. is set to impose some of the strongest sanctions on Iran as part of his plans to make Iran agree on a new nuclear deal. President Trump stated that the new deal will ensure the safety of the world from Iran's nuclear program.
Iranian students burned U.S. flags and chanted anti-American slogans outside the former U.S. embassy in Tehran on Wednesday. Some said the nuclear deal has not improved their lives and that U.S. sanctions cannot make it worse. Iranian leaders have threatened to resume the country's uranium enrichment program, but Trump expressed confidence they will agree to negotiate for a new deal.
And Iran will come back and say, we don't want to negotiate, and of course they're going to say that, and if I were their position, I'd say that too for the first couple of months. We're not going to negotiate, but they'll negotiate.
Some analysts say Iran could indeed agree to discuss a new agreement because its leadership is weaker now than it was in 2009 when it began negotiations for the current deal.
They're in trouble, they're vulnerable, they're desperate, they're extremely afraid of their own population, that further escalation on their part would bring about more outrage on the part of the population, because the people are saying, you haven't dealt with our issues.
Critics of the Iran deal say it does not control Iran's ballistic missile program or Iran's support for extremist groups in Iraq, Syria, Yemen and Lebanon. But U.S. allies Britain, Germany and France say that any deal that holds Iran's nuclear arms development is better than none.
Je regrette la décision du président américain.
I regret the decision of the American president. I think it is a mistake, and that's why we Europeans have decided, and we said it again last night, to remain in the 2015 accord, as I had the opportunity earlier to remind Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. This deal, we negotiated it, we signed it, and it is the best way to control Iranian defense nuclear activity until 2025.
Questions have also been raised about the United States' credibility in the upcoming negotiations with North Korea on dismantling its nuclear program. Some analysts say Trump's decision on the Iran deal sends a strong message to North Korea that the United States would rather have no agreement at all than a bad agreement.
Migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea to Italy have filed a lawsuit against the collaboration between Italy and Libya Coast Guard at the European Court of Human Rights. Italy enters an agreement with the Libyan Coast Guard to stop migrants from crossing the sea to Italy.
These scenes of African migrants rescued at sea and brought to Italian ports have been the norm for years. Until recently, the Italian Coast Guard coordinated these rescue efforts. To put an end to the constant crossings, Italy made an agreement with Libya.
Italy and the EU have essentially re-established the Libyan Coast Guard, which was operationally in existence until the end of 2015.
Hella prepared a report used in a lawsuit filed against Italy by 17 Nigerian migrants who survived a deadly sea crossing in November. He and the plaintiff's lawyers claim the Libyan Coast Guard has operated as Italy's proxy to intercept migrants and take them back to unacceptable conditions in Libya.
Italy and the EU have implemented their policy with full knowledge of the violent and criminal behavior of the Libyan Coast Guard and of the fate of extreme forms of violence and exploitation that has awaited many of those returned to Libya.
Amnesty International says the Libyan Coast Guard intercepted more than 20,000 migrants in 2017. This led to a significant drop in arrivals on the Italian coastline.
While this operation has temporarily succeeded in stemming crossing, this has been done by the outsourcing of human rights violations to Libyan actors and has made migrants bear a human cost that is far too high.
The Italian government has not yet reacted to the lawsuit filed last week. While the legal challenge may represent the best hope for change for the many migrants hoping to improve their lives, the lengthy process could take up to 3 years.
Many people drink a cup of tea to start their day. However, only few people do know the source and the processes. This report looks at tea production from Kenya, one of the world's top 5 tea producers.
What you see here looks like a green carpet, but it's not. This is a canopy of lush green tea leaves across massive plantations in Limuru, about a 45-minute drive from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Fiona Vernon runs the Kiambethu tea farm she inherited from her grandfather, who was a British settler and said to be the first to grow tea commercially in Kenya on a 60-acre farm.
Tea is an excellent crop for a large estate or smallholders because you pick it every 2 to 3 weeks, all the way through the year. So if you've got enough land to grow your food crops and maybe 5, 15, 20 acres of tea, you've got a constant income all through the year.
Tea begins with a seed, but what is largely grown now is a clone.
And your tea bushes will last between 50 and 70 years, as long as you keep picking them, fertilizing them and pruning them.
As we drive through tea plantations, we meet men and women picking tea with huge baskets strapped on their backs. They are fast and skilled at their job. Each basket holds up to 10 kilograms of tea leaves.
When you get to the factory, they inspect it very carefully and they want the nice soft leaves that are going to produce a good soft tea.
We arrive at Maramba Tea Factory, where tea is processed from the leaf to the cup. Factory manager Simon Karanja walks us through the steps of tea processing.
And the source of the raw material is actually the farmers, whom we have contracted to be supplying us with green leaf. Our work is to process the teas, market the teas, and pay back the farmers.
Farmers deliver freshly picked tea leaves in trucks that go over a weighbridge to collect data on kilograms delivered. Once the trucks offload the tea leaves, they are weighed again and the gross net is recorded. And that figure is used to determine how much they get paid at the end of the month. The first step in tea processing is called withering. Monorails calibrated with hoops assist in offloading the fresh tea leaves to the decks. Production supervisor Lawrence Kimotho explains.
We are reducing the moisture content of this leaf by blowing in the air. This trough is provided with a mesh which is perforated, which allows air to go through the leaf. The process takes 8 to 16 hours.
What happens at the sifting is the withered leaf is run through a vibrating mechanism. The reason for doing this is to get rid of any foreign particles that could be in the tea.
The next stages are the cutting, tearing and curling of the leaves before fermentation.
Fermentation process takes about 1 to 1.5 hours. It is here that you form the taste of your tea.
The fermented tea goes through dryers to discharge black tea.
With some hot water, you can make a cup of tea at this point.
From here, the fermented tea goes through the sorting process using sieves of different mesh sizes, and then it's graded based on particle sizes from the biggest particles to the finer ones, and lastly, the finest, which looks like dust.
There is somebody who would want maybe a very strong cup of tea. This is somebody who will go maybe for the finest grade.
At the quality control room, Lawrence tastes the different grades of tea for briskness, strength, and brightness.
You draw in the mouth, you jet in and atomize it in the mouth so that you pick all the flavors of tea. That is the strength, the briskness. As far as these liquors are concerned, everything is okay. These teas are good to go to the market.
The factory specializes in black tea, which is now ready for packaging.
For your teas to remain fresh, they need to be as airtight as possible.
It is then taken to Mombasa for auction.
It is at Mombasa where we have the biggest tea auction, where all the teas from East and Central Africa meet for marketing. After the teas have been marketed, what happens now, we get back the payment, we pay back our growers, we pay the workers, and we keep everybody happy.
While you can still get pure black tea in Kenya's supermarkets, there are variations, with buyers and entrepreneurs adding flavors such as ginger, herbs, and spices to attract a wide range of customers. And if you're like me, anytime is tea time.
With our report, we conclude the news roundup for this week. Thank you for being part of the program. I am Tunde Alabi. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye. Regardless, residents status abroad, living outside the shores of one's homeland can really be challenging and sometimes very difficult. Let's be sincere, to keep pace with updates from the host country abroad can really be difficult. Here on Dialogue in Diaspora, we give you every information, every news, every current issue you need to know on happenings outside the UK. Dialogue in Diaspora is your link between the world and the United Kingdom. It's your window to Africa development. Here, live on Ben Television.